Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Pearson, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The darkness that settled over Atkinson County in 1917 began like most stories of horror, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The newly formed county, carved from portions of Clinch and Coffee counties that year, would become home to one of Georgia's most unsettling mysteries, a mystery that even today remains shrouded in whispers and half-forgotten memories. Pearson, the small settlement that would become the county seat, was nothing remarkable at first glance. Established in the 1890s alongside the Brunswick and Albany Railroad, it was one of those towns that seemed destined to remain a footnote in history. The railroad had brought modest prosperity, a depot, a general store, a small hotel for traveling salesmen who rarely stayed more than a single night. The air smelled of pine sap and locomotive smoke. Women exchanged recipes and quiet judgments on porches in the heavy afternoon heat. Yet there was something about the land, something in the heavy, humid air and the way shadows pooled beneath the pine trees at dusk, that seemed to suggest an awareness, as if the very soil held secrets. Old-timers spoke of strange sounds that carried across the fields on windless nights, of livestock that refused to graze in certain areas, of compasses that spun without reason in specific locations just outside town. These stories were dismissed as superstition by newcomers, evidence of the lingering folklore that still infected rural communities, despite the march of progress and modernity. The Jenkins house stood on the northeastern edge of town, its white clapboard facade weathered by seasons of rain and relentless Georgia sun. Thomas Jenkins had purchased the property in 1915, moving his wife Margaret and their belongings from Savannah, with dreams of establishing a mercantile business to serve the growing community. At 38, Thomas possessed the confident demeanor of a man accustomed to making correct decisions. His store ledgers were immaculate, his investments prudent, his manner reserved but unfailingly courteous. Margaret, 5 years his junior, had the pale complexion of a woman raised in genteel circumstances, now adjusting to the more rustic setting of rural Georgia. She maintained an extensive correspondence with family in Savannah, detailing her efforts to cultivate a garden suitable to their new home and her cautious integration into local society. Her letters, preserved in the county historical archives, reveal a woman of intelligence and observation, noting the subtle social hierarchies of Pearson with the precision of an anthropologist. The couple was well regarded, their arrival viewed as a sign of Pearson's promising future. Thomas, with his meticulous ledgers and careful planning, had built a modest but successful store near the railroad depot. Margaret kept their home immaculate, the garden beds blooming with carefully tended roses despite the unforgiving climate. They attended the Methodist church each Sunday, donated appropriately to local causes, and maintained a respectful distance from the petty disputes that occasionally rippled through the small community. "I find Pearson agreeable enough," Thomas wrote in correspondence to his brother in Atlanta, dated February 1917. Though Margaret complains of a peculiar stillness that settles over the property at night, says it feels as if the house is listening. I attribute it to the adjustment from city life to our more rural setting. The nights are indeed darker here, the silence more complete, without the constant bustle of Savannah. One hears things in such silence that might otherwise go unnoticed, the settling of wood, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Margaret will acclimate in time. What no one in town knew, what no one could have possibly known, was that the land where the Jenkins house stood had a history that predated the town itself. Before railroad surveyors had marked their maps, before timber companies had harvested the ancient pines, local Creek Indian settlements had designated the area as forbidden ground. The elders spoke of it as a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin, a place where voices carried across impossible distances, where the earth itself seemed to breathe in the deepest hours of night. These warnings, dismissed as superstition by white settlers, were lost to time and the systematic erasure of indigenous knowledge. By 1917, the nearest Creek settlements were long gone, their people forcibly relocated decades earlier. Only fragments of their understanding remained, preserved in stories told by elderly residents who had heard them second or third hand, already distorted by translation and cultural misinterpretation. One such story, recorded by a traveling folklorist in 1905, described a place in the region where the ground speaks to those who listen. According to the account, a Creek hunting party had once camped in this location and awoke to find intricate patterns carved into the trunks of surrounding trees, patterns that had not been there at nightfall. The hunting party abandoned the site immediately, but one young man, drawn by curiosity or perhaps something more insidious, returned alone the following night. When his companions went searching for him days later, they found only his belongings arranged in a careful circle, the same patterns now etched into the soil within. By April of 1917, Thomas Jenkins had expanded his business interests, purchasing timber rights to a tract of land 10 miles south of town. The United States had just entered the Great War, and demand for lumber was expected to increase dramatically. It was a shrewd business decision, one that promised to elevate the Jenkins family's standing even further. Thomas hired a crew of local men to begin clearing the land, establishing a small camp near the site to minimize daily travel. He personally oversaw the operation several days each week, often staying overnight in a cabin hastily constructed for that purpose. It was during these overnight stays, according to later accounts from the workers, that Thomas first began to exhibit unusual behaviors. Mr. Jenkins took to walking the property at night, reported Samuel Davis, one of the hired laborers. In a statement given to Sheriff Blackwell after the disappearance, said he was checking for trespassers, but there wasn't nobody out there but us and the owls. He'd come back before dawn, his shoes covered in mud, sometimes scratches on his hands and face, like he'd been pushing through thorny brush. Never said what he found. Started asking strange questions, too. If any of us heard voices while we were working, if we noticed any unusual markings on the trees we were cutting. Most peculiar was when he asked if any of us had dreams about tunnels or passages. Said it like it was normal conversation, like asking about the weather. Thomas has been working late hours, Margaret confided to her sister, in correspondence dated May 8th. He says he hears something in the walls at night, a tapping, like someone trying to communicate. I've heard nothing myself, but he insists. Last Tuesday he woke at 3 a.m. and spent until dawn in the parlor, ear pressed against the wall. When I asked him what he was doing, he said only that they were trying to show him something. I worry about his health. He returns from the timber site exhausted, yet cannot rest. He's begun making sketches, patterns of circles and lines that he says come to him in dreams. He's filled nearly an entire notebook with these drawings. When I suggested he consult Dr. Hargrove about his insomnia, he became uncharacteristically angry, accusing me of failing to understand the importance of what's happening. I hardly know what to make of it. By late May, Thomas had ceased his regular visits to the timber site, delegating supervision to his foreman, while he immersed himself in what Margaret described as research. The nature of this research became clear when a substantial shipment of books arrived from a bookseller in Atlanta. Obscure volumes on geology, cave systems, ancient civilizations, and occult symbolism. Thomas converted the small sitting room off the main parlor into a study, its walls soon covered with maps of the region and his own increasingly elaborate drawings. The first public indication that something was amiss came during a town council meeting in early June. Thomas, normally reserved and articulate, delivered a rambling address about passages beneath the town and voices in the timber. He suggested that Pearson had been built upon something far older, a network of tunnels and chambers that predates human settlement entirely. Several attendees later described his appearance as disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from apparent lack of sleep. Margaret, seated in the back of the room, kept her gaze fixed on her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of controlled distress. Dr. William Hargrove, the town's only physician, visited the Jenkins home the following day at Margaret's request. His subsequent notes, discovered decades later in county archives, described Thomas as agitated but lucid and suggested a regimen of rest and reduced work hours. The doctor made no mention of Thomas's increasingly bizarre claims, perhaps out of professional discretion, or perhaps because such things were best left unrecorded. I found Mr. Jenkins in an excitable state, but not what I would classify as delirium or mania, wrote Dr. Hargrove. His pulse and respiration were elevated, but not alarmingly so. Pupils reactive, no evidence of fever. He spoke coherently, though his topics of conversation were unusual. When questioned directly about his health, he acknowledged some difficulty sleeping, but attributed this to important work rather than illness. Mrs. Jenkins reports he has been eating poorly and seems obsessed with certain ideas regarding geological formations beneath the town. I have prescribed a mild sedative to promote rest and suggested a reduction in work responsibilities for at least a fortnight. We'll follow up in 1 week if condition persists. Throughout the summer, townspeople reported seeing Thomas at odd hours, standing motionless at the edge of the woods that bordered his property, or walking the railroad tracks before dawn, as if searching for something. When approached, he was unfailingly polite but distant, his responses mechanical and his attention clearly elsewhere. Margaret was seen less and less frequently, her absence from church services and social gatherings noted but not remarked upon. In small communities like Pearson, privacy was both respected and suspicious. Reports from the Jenkins household staff, a housekeeper who came 3 times weekly, and a young man who tended the grounds, painted an increasingly disturbing picture. According to Mary Wilson, the housekeeper, Thomas had begun marking the walls by early July. At first it was just pencil marks, Wilson told Sheriff Blackwell, little dots and patterns, mostly in the study. I thought it was related to his maps or whatever he was working on, but then I started finding them in other rooms, the parlor, the dining room, even the upstairs hallway. By August, he'd taken to making actual holes in the plaster with an awl or something similar. Mrs. Jenkins tried to stop him at first, but he became so agitated that she eventually just let him continue. She instructed me to say nothing about it to anyone in town, said her husband was under significant strain due to business matters and would soon recover. The last time I cleaned the house, every room had these strange patterns of holes. Some were connected with strings like an art project. Mr. Jenkins told me not to touch them, that they were coordinates of some kind. I didn't ask coordinates to what. The groundskeeper, 18-year-old Joseph Miller, reported even stranger behavior. According to Miller, Thomas had instructed him in late July to dig a series of small holes in the yard behind the house, following a precise pattern marked with stakes and string. The holes were to be exactly 1 inch in diameter and 18 inches deep. It made no sense to me, Miller recalled, but Mr. Jenkins was insistent. Said it had to be done exactly as he specified. I dug maybe 30 holes before Mrs. Jenkins came out and told me to stop, that there had been a misunderstanding. She seemed embarrassed, gave me the rest of the day's wages, and sent me home. When I returned 2 days later, all the holes had been filled in, or at least I thought they had. Later I realized they hadn't been filled. They'd just disappeared like they'd closed up on their own somehow. The ground was smooth and undisturbed. I figured Mr. Jenkins must have done it, though I couldn't understand how he'd managed it without leaving any sign of disturbance. What happened on the night of September 17, 1917, would become the subject of speculation for generations. According to the only documented account, written by Sheriff Robert Blackwell, a neighbor reported seeing unusual lights in the windows of the Jenkins house shortly after midnight. Given Thomas's recent erratic behavior, the sheriff decided to investigate immediately rather than waiting until morning. I approached the house from the western side, Blackwell wrote in his official report. All lamps appeared to be lit, which struck me as unusual for the hour. The front door stood open. I announced myself before entering, but received no response. The interior of the home was in a state of considerable disarray, furniture overturned, papers scattered. What was most peculiar were the markings on the walls, dozens, perhaps hundreds of small holes approximately 1 inch in diameter, arranged in patterns I cannot describe, except to say they did not appear random. They covered every wall in every room. Of the Jenkins couple, I found no trace. The sheriff's report continued with a methodical inventory of the house contents. Nothing of value appeared to be missing. Thomas's wallet containing $23 lay on his desk. Margaret's jewelry box remained undisturbed on her dressing table, including several pieces of considerable value. There was no sign of blood or struggle beyond the overturned furniture, which seemed almost deliberately arranged, rather than the result of violent confrontation. Most curious, Blackwell noted, was the state of the kitchen. A meal had been prepared but not consumed. 2 plates of food sat on the table, untouched, alongside 2 cups of tea that appeared to have been abandoned mid-consumption. The stove was still slightly warm. In the pantry, I discovered a basket packed with bread, preserved meats, and 2 bottles of water, as if prepared for a journey. Yet the couple's automobile remained in the carriage house, and no horses were missing from the small stable on the property. The subsequent investigation revealed little. No blood, no signs of struggle beyond the overturned furniture. The couple's clothing remained in wardrobes, food in the pantry, Thomas's wallet, and Margaret's jewelry box untouched on their respective dressers. The only things definitively missing were the Jenkinses themselves. Sheriff Blackwell organized a search party at first light. For 3 days, men combed the woods, dragged the nearby creek, and questioned every resident within 10 miles. No trace of the couple was found, no sightings reported. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the strange constellation of holes puncturing the walls of their home. The investigation might have continued indefinitely had national circumstances not intervened. With America's entry into World War I, local resources were increasingly directed toward the war effort. Young men enlisted, leaving fewer hands for civilian matters. The mystery of the Jenkins disappearance, while disturbing, gradually receded from immediate concern. One curious footnote to the initial investigation came from Elijah Turner, an elderly farmer whose property adjoined the wooded area behind the Jenkins home. Turner reported to Sheriff Blackwell that on the night of the disappearance, he had been awoken by what he described as a humming sound, like machinery, but softer, more musical-like. When he looked out his window toward the Jenkins property, he claimed to have seen a peculiar illumination among the trees, not bright like a fire, more like a glow coming up from the ground itself. Turner, known locally for his fondness for homemade spirits, was not considered a reliable witness, and his account was largely dismissed. The case remained officially open but effectively abandoned until 1919, when a surveying team working for a timber company made a discovery in a remote area of woods approximately 15 miles from Pearson. In a clearing that showed no signs of human activity, no cut trees, no trail leading to or from it, they found a single woman's shoe. The style and size matched those known to be worn by Margaret Jenkins. Despite renewed searching, nothing else was found. The shoe itself became a subject of controversy. According to the initial report filed by the survey team, the shoe appeared remarkably well preserved, as if recently placed rather than exposed to elements for nearly 2 years. Yet when Sheriff Blackwell arrived to collect the evidence 3 days later, he described it as weathered and partially decomposed, consistent with long exposure. This discrepancy was never reconciled. The shoe was photographed and stored among case evidence, but disappeared from the sheriff's office sometime before 1925, when a routine inventory noted its absence. The house itself remained vacant, its ownership unclear after the disappearance. No relatives came forward to claim the property. Locals began to whisper that it was haunted, daring each other to approach its sagging porch or peer through its grimy windows. Adults walked the opposite side of the street when passing. In 1923, a fire of undetermined origin destroyed the structure completely. An account of the fire, published in the county's weekly newspaper, noted something peculiar. As flames consumed the abandoned Jenkins residence, witnesses reported hearing what sounded like tapping or knocking from within the walls, as if someone or something was attempting to escape the conflagration. Fire Chief Williams dismissed these reports, attributing the sounds to the natural processes of a burning structure. For decades, the Jenkins case remained nothing more than a local curiosity, occasionally mentioned but never resolved. Then, in 1951, during expansion of the county records building, workers discovered a sealed metal box in the cornerstone of the original structure. Inside was a journal, its leather cover weather-worn but intact, bearing the name Thomas Jenkins. The journal had been hidden by Sheriff Blackwell, who died in 1927 without ever revealing its existence. His handwritten note, tucked inside the front cover, explained his decision. I cannot determine if the contents of this journal represent the delusions of a disturbed mind or something far worse. In either case, I believe it would cause only harm to make it public during the lifetime of those who knew Thomas and Margaret. Perhaps future generations will be better equipped to understand what transpired. I have removed certain pages which contain drawings I found too disturbing to preserve. May God forgive me if I have made the wrong decision. The journal's contents were indeed disturbing. Beginning as mundane business records in January 1917, the entries gradually shifted to descriptions of voices in the walls and visitors in the night. By June, Thomas was describing elaborate tunnel systems beneath Pearson, supposedly revealed to him by these visitors who communicated through tapping in the walls. They have shown me the passages, read one entry from late July. Ancient beyond comprehension, they existed before the town, before any human settlement. The visitors say they have been waiting for someone who could hear them. I am not the first they have called to, but I am the first who has answered. The passages lead to chambers deep below, where something waits that they call the Silent One. I cannot yet grasp their full meaning. Their method of communication is imprecise, relying on rhythms and patterns rather than words. But I am learning. Each day, I understand more. Subsequent entries detailed Thomas's nocturnal explorations of these supposed tunnels accessed through a hidden entrance in the woods behind his property. He described structures of unknown origin and purpose, their walls covered in symbols similar to those he began carving into the walls of his home, the holes that Sheriff Blackwell had found so peculiar. The symbols are a language, Thomas wrote in August, not meant to be spoken, but to be felt. Each configuration creates a different sensation when traced with the fingertips. Some produce a sense of direction, others convey more complex concepts. The visitors insist I recreate these patterns in my home, that doing so establishes a connection between their realm and ours. Margaret thinks I've gone mad. Perhaps I have. But madness would be simpler than the truth I've discovered. By early September, Thomas's entries had become increasingly erratic, jumping between precise, technical descriptions of tunnel layouts and passages of near poetry about the breathing earth and voices in the stones. He made repeated references to the Silent One that supposedly dwelled in the deepest chamber, though he never clearly described this entity. It waits in darkness, he wrote, not malevolent, but utterly inhuman in its patience. The visitors are its emissaries, its senses extended into our world. They tell me it has been there since before humans walked upright, watching, listening. They say it knows secrets about the nature of reality, about the thin places where worlds overlap. They want me to meet it. They promise revelation. The final entry, dated September 17, 1917, read simply, Margaret has agreed to come with me tonight. They have promised to show us wonders beyond imagination. We will leave this world behind. The journal was examined by several experts in the 1950s, who concluded that while the handwriting was consistent throughout and matched known samples of Thomas Jenkins's script, the content likely represented an elaborate delusion. No evidence of tunnel systems has ever been found beneath Pearson or the surrounding area. The leading theory became that Thomas, suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness, had convinced or coerced his wife to accompany him into the wilderness, where they presumably perished from exposure or other natural causes. This might have remained the accepted explanation had it not been for Harold Miller, a retired geology professor who became fascinated with the case in the 1960s. Miller conducted extensive research into the area's topography and discovered something unusual. A network of limestone caves extended through the region, some portions potentially passing near Pearson. While none had known entrances in the immediate vicinity of the town, the possibility existed that Thomas Jenkins had somehow discovered access to this natural formation. The geological composition of the area makes subterranean formations entirely plausible, Miller wrote in his research notes. Limestone is highly susceptible to dissolution by groundwater, creating cave systems over time. What's unusual about this particular region is the depth at which these formations occur, typically much deeper than similar systems elsewhere in Georgia. This depth may explain why no obvious surface connections have been documented. It doesn't explain Jenkins's supposed access, but it does lend a degree of credibility to the basic premise of underground passages. Miller published his findings in an obscure academic journal in 1965, suggesting that perhaps Jenkins had not been entirely delusional. The paper attracted little attention outside specialist circles, and Miller himself admitted that the cave theory did not explain the couple's disappearance or the strange holes in the walls of their home. Even if we accept the existence of cave systems beneath Pearson, he concluded, we're still left with the fundamental question, what happened to Thomas and Margaret Jenkins? Natural cave formations don't communicate through walls. They don't have emissaries. They don't invite exploration. If Thomas Jenkins discovered a genuine geological feature, it seems his mental state led him to construct an elaborate mythology around it, a mythology that ultimately led to tragedy. The case might have faded completely from memory were it not for a series of unusual incidents beginning in 1972. Construction workers breaking ground for a new municipal building in Pearson uncovered a sealed ceramic container approximately 6 feet below the surface. Inside was a woman's wedding ring, its inner band inscribed with the initials MTJ, Margaret Thomas Jenkins. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the decades-old mystery. How had Margaret Jenkins's ring come to be buried at that location, a site that historical records showed had been vacant land in 1917? No construction or excavation had been documented there prior to 1972. Some speculated that the ring had been planted as a hoax, though no one could suggest a plausible perpetrator or motive. The municipal building project was temporarily halted while authorities conducted a more thorough examination of the site, concerned that human remains might be present. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no evidence of burial, but did detect what the technician described as anomalous void spaces extending beneath and beyond the construction area. Budget constraints and the absence of any definitive connection to the Jenkins case led officials to proceed with construction after a 2-week delay. The ring was placed in the County Historical Society's collection, where it remains today. The following year, during renovation of one of the town's oldest buildings, at a feed store that had operated since 1909, workers discovered something even more unsettling behind a section of wall, a small leather pouch containing human teeth. Dental records from that era were non-existent, making identification impossible, but the timing and location fueled inevitable connections to the Jenkins case. Forensic examination of the teeth in 1973 determined they belonged to an adult male, approximately 45 years of age, consistent with Thomas Jenkins's age at the time of his disappearance. More puzzling was the condition of the teeth They showed unusual patterns of wear that the examining dentist described as consistent with repeated contact with abrasive minerals, such as might occur if someone habitually held stone or soil particles between the teeth. This peculiar detail, while inconclusive, added another layer of mystery to the case. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made in 1978 by a geology student exploring the wooded area where the Jenkins house had once stood. Among the underbrush and accumulated debris of decades, the student found a metal box containing dozens of photographic plates. The images, once developed, showed the interior of a home presumed to be the Jenkins residence. Several photos focused on sections of wall covered in the distinctive hole patterns described in Sheriff Blackwell's report. Other images were harder to interpret: dark, blurred shots of what might have been tunnel interiors, strange angular structures unlike typical cave formations, and in one particularly unsettling image, what appeared to be a human silhouette standing at the end of a narrow passage, its proportions somehow wrong. Photographic experts who examined the plates in 1979 confirmed they were consistent with technology available in 1917, but could offer no explanation for how they had remained undiscovered for over 60 years in an area that had been searched multiple times. The photographic emulsions should have degraded significantly over such a period, particularly in Georgia's humid climate, yet the images remained remarkably clear. One expert suggested the box might have been buried and only recently exposed by erosion, though no evidence of soil disturbance was reported by the student who found it. The most disturbing aspect of the photographs was their implication that Thomas Jenkins had not been merely delusional, that he had actually documented something beyond ordinary explanation. The images of tunnel interiors, while blurry and poorly lit, showed spaces with unnaturally smooth walls marked with regular patterns of indentations. These were not typical limestone cave formations. If authentic, they depicted constructed spaces, not natural ones. These discoveries, spread across several years, suggested something more complex than a simple case of mental illness and wilderness misadventure. Yet no cohesive alternative theory emerged. The physical evidence, the ring, the teeth, the photographs, pointed toward a story far stranger than anything in the official record, but one that remained frustratingly incomplete. In 1982, an elderly woman named Eleanor Hargrove, the daughter of Dr. William Hargrove, who had treated Thomas Jenkins, came forward with a startling claim. According to Eleanor, her father had confided in her, shortly before his death in 1943, that Sheriff Blackwell had shown him something found in the Jenkins house that had never been included in official reports, a stack of papers covered in writing that was not English nor any language I recognized, accompanied by diagrams of the hole patterns in the walls. Father told me the sheriff brought these papers to him in strict confidence, Eleanor recounted, in a recorded interview with the County Historical Society. He said they'd been found hidden beneath a floorboard in Jenkins's study. The writing resembled no language either of them had ever seen, not European, not Asian, nothing identifiable. The symbols were composed of dots and lines arranged in complex patterns. Father said looking at them for too long gave him headaches, as if the patterns were somehow shifting when not directly observed. Sheriff Blackwell was deeply disturbed by them and wanted Father's opinion as the most educated man in town. Dr. Hargrove, according to his daughter, had urged the sheriff to destroy these papers, believing them to be dangerous in ways I cannot articulate. Whether Blackwell followed this advice remains unknown. No such papers were found among his effects after his death, nor in the county archives. Father rarely spoke of the Jenkins case, Eleanor continued, but when he did, it was always with a certain tension, a reluctance that seemed born of fear, rather than professional discretion. The night before he died, and I've never told anyone this before, he woke suddenly and claimed he could hear tapping in the walls. He made me promise to leave the house immediately if I ever heard such sounds myself. His last coherent words were, "They're still looking for someone who can hear them." At the time, I attributed this to delirium. Now, I'm not so certain. In 1985, during a period of unusually heavy rainfall, a sinkhole opened in the woods approximately 7 miles from Pearson. Local authorities, investigating to ensure no hazard to nearby properties, discovered a narrow vertical shaft descending at least 30 feet before opening into what appeared to be a horizontal passage. Equipment limitations and safety concerns prevented full exploration at that time. The county engineer who initially examined the sinkhole, Robert Campbell, reported something unusual about its formation. Most sinkholes are roughly circular or oval, he noted in his assessment. This one was almost perfectly square, approximately 3 feet on each side. The sides were remarkably straight, as if cut rather than formed by natural collapse. I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of civil engineering. When a properly equipped geological survey team returned 3 weeks later, they found the sinkhole had collapsed further, completely sealing whatever lay beneath. Radar and sonar equipment detected void spaces extending in multiple directions, consistent with a cave system, but no further exploration was attempted. The decision not to investigate further was primarily financial, explained County Commissioner Edward Mitchell in a 1986 interview with the local newspaper. The equipment and expertise required for safe exploration would have cost tens of thousands of dollars, funds our county simply didn't have for what amounted to scientific curiosity. There was no imminent public safety issue once the initial opening had sealed itself, so we allocated resources elsewhere. Privately, however, some members of the survey team expressed disappointment with the decision. One geologist, speaking anonymously, claimed that preliminary sonar readings had detected structural regularities inconsistent with natural formation processes, and that something down there deserved a closer look. Whether these concerns were legitimate scientific observations or merely frustrated professional interest remains unclear. The final documented connection to the Jenkins case came in 1991 when an anonymous donor provided funds for the establishment of a small historical museum in Pearson. Among the stipulations was that a particular sealed display case be included, its contents unseen by anyone except the elderly donor. The case, approximately 3 feet square, was to remain sealed until 2017, exactly 100 years after the disappearance. The museum board accepted these unusual terms, and the mysterious case sat in the corner of the main exhibition room for 26 years, the subject of endless speculation. Some believed it contained definitive evidence about the Jenkins disappearance. Others suggested it was merely an elaborate publicity stunt. The donor's identity remained a closely guarded secret, though rumors persisted that it was a descendant of Sheriff Blackwell who had inherited family documents related to the case. The sealed case generated considerable local interest in the Jenkins story. Residents wrote essays speculating about its contents. Amateur historians compiled timelines and theories. Occasionally, paranormal enthusiasts would visit the museum, claiming to sense unusual energy around the case or to hear faint tapping sounds emanating from within. Museum staff dismissed these claims as imagination fueled by the mystery's allure. On September 17, 2017, a small crowd gathered for the official opening of the case. Present were local officials, historians, and descendants of families who had lived in Pearson during the era of the disappearance. As the museum curator removed the seals and lifted the lid, an audible murmur passed through the assembled crowd. The case contained only 2 items, a single sheet of paper and a small cloth bag. The paper bore a typewritten message. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The pattern is the key. They are still waiting for someone who can hear them. The cloth bag contained dirt, ordinary Georgia clay, according to subsequent analysis. Nothing else. Many interpreted the anticlimactic revelation as confirmation that the century-old mystery had been nothing more than an elaborate local legend embellished over generations until fact became indistinguishable from fiction. The donor, whoever they were, had apparently orchestrated a final chapter consistent with the story's enigmatic nature. Yet something unusual did occur in the weeks following the case opening. Residents of Pearson reported an increased incidence of strange sounds at night, tapping, as if from within the walls of their homes. Several people described vivid dreams of underground passages and voices speaking in unfamiliar languages. Local physicians noted a slight uptick in complaints of insomnia and headaches, with no apparent physiological cause. Most disturbing was the account of James Foster, the museum curator who had opened the sealed case. 2 weeks after the event, Foster reported to local police that someone had broken into his home and carved small holes in his bedroom wall, holes approximately 1 inch in diameter, arranged in a distinctive pattern. When officers arrived to investigate, they found the wall unmarked. Foster, visibly distressed, insisted the holes had been there moments before. In a statement to police, Foster described waking in the middle of the night to a sound like fingernails lightly tapping on plaster. When he turned on the light, he discovered the pattern of holes across his bedroom wall. They seemed to pulse slightly, he reported, as if breathing. I touched one and felt something moving inside the wall. That's when I called 911. By the time the officers arrived, the holes had closed up completely. I know how this sounds, but I'm not imagining things. Something is happening. It started with the opening of that case. 3 days later, Foster failed to arrive for work. When police conducted a welfare check at his residence, they found the home empty, no sign of Foster or any personal belongings. His car remained in the driveway. His cell phone, wallet, and keys were on the kitchen counter. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside them. The Foster disappearance was ultimately attributed to a mental health crisis, perhaps triggered by the stress and attention surrounding the museum event. Most assumed he had simply chosen to leave town, though no subsequent trace of him has ever been found. No financial transactions, no social media activity, no confirmed sightings. One detail from the police report, typically omitted from public accounts, notes that officers found Foster's laptop open on his desk. The screen displayed a document containing nothing but rows of periods and dashes, arranged in patterns reminiscent of Morse code, but translating to no recognizable message. Computer forensics determined the document had been created at 3:17 a.m. on the morning of Foster's disappearance, though whether by Foster himself or someone else could not be established. Today, Pearson continues as a small, quiet community. The story of Thomas and Margaret Jenkins persists as local lore, told with varying degrees of embellishment, depending on who's doing the telling. Some residents claim to hear tapping in their walls on particularly still nights. Others avoid the wooded areas where the Jenkins home once stood. Skeptics point out that many elements of the story likely evolved through decades of retelling, the facts distorted or invented to create a more compelling narrative. The human predisposition for pattern recognition, they argue, explains the holes in the walls as possibly mundane damage reinterpreted through a lens of mystery. The various discovered artifacts, the ring, the teeth, the photographs, have all been subject to questions of authenticity or interpretation. Yet the core mystery remains unsolved. 2 people vanished without trace. Their home was found empty, marked with inexplicable patterns. No bodies were ever recovered, no definitive explanation established. Perhaps most unsettling is a detail from Sheriff Blackwell's original report that is often omitted from retellings. Upon exiting the Jenkins residence, I observed what appeared to be a line of small holes in the ground, each approximately 1 inch in diameter, extending from the back door of the home toward the woods. They continued for approximately 50 yards before disappearing among the trees. When I returned the following morning to continue my investigation, these holes had vanished completely, the ground undisturbed as if they had never existed. In 2019, a visiting geology student conducting research on limestone formations in the region reported something peculiar. While taking soil samples approximately 5 miles from Pearson, she claimed to have heard rhythmic tapping sounds emanating from beneath the ground. When she placed her recording equipment against the soil, the sounds became clearer, a distinct pattern of taps and pauses that repeated at regular intervals. The recording, analyzed by audio experts, was determined to be consistent with deliberate communication rather than natural geological processes or wildlife activity. No explanation for the phenomenon was established, and attempts to record similar sounds at the same location were unsuccessful. Later that same year, an elderly resident of a nursing home in nearby Willacoochee made a deathbed confession to his attending nurse. The man, who had grown up in Pearson, claimed that, as a young adult in the 1930s, he and several friends had discovered a door in the ground while hunting in the woods. They had opened it and glimpsed a stairway going down into darkness. Frightened, they had fled without exploring further. When they returned the next day, intending to be braver, the door was gone, the ground unbroken, as if nothing had ever been there. The man had never told anyone, fearing ridicule. By the time his story was reported to local historians, he had passed away, taking any further details with him. Occasionally, visitors to Pearson report an unusual quiet that seems to settle over certain areas, a stillness so complete it feels like absence rather than silence. Longtime residents say you get used to it, that strange feeling of being listened to. They don't walk in the woods at night. They don't investigate tapping sounds in their walls. And if they wake at 3 a.m. to find themselves inexplicably drawn to press an ear against the plaster, they resist the urge. They turn on every light instead and wait for dawn. In 2020, during construction of a new cell phone tower on the outskirts of town, workers uncovered a curious artifact approximately 4 feet below ground level, a small metal box containing a handwritten journal. The pages were blank except for the first, which bore a single sentence: "We found another way in." Forensic analysis of the paper and ink suggested the journal dated to the early 1920s, though who had buried it and why remains unknown. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some stories, once started, write themselves. And sometimes in places like Pearson, Georgia, the boundary between fact and folklore, between history and horror, becomes as thin and permeable as the walls between worlds. According to county records archived in 1968, a geological survey conducted in the area surrounding Pearson identified unusual subterranean formations that defy conventional categorization. The report was subsequently classified and removed from public access. Freedom of Information Act requests regarding this survey have been consistently denied on grounds of public safety concerns. The last known photograph of James Foster, taken by a security camera at the Pearson Museum the day before his disappearance, shows him standing before an empty wall, his hand raised as if tracing a pattern only he could see. His expression, according to those who have viewed the footage, was not one of fear, but of recognition. In 2022, a graduate student researching historical disappearances in rural Georgia discovered an unusual pattern. Since 1917, 11 people had vanished within a 15-mile radius of Pearson. Each disappearance occurred on September 17th of their respective years. Each occurred without witnesses. In each case, the missing person had recently reported hearing unusual sounds in their homes. Local authorities dismissed the statistical correlation as coincidental, pointing out that the total number of disappearances over more than a century was not significantly higher than similar rural areas. The student's research was never published. Her academic advisor reported that she had abandoned the project suddenly, leaving behind only a note saying she needed to follow a different line of inquiry. She has not returned to the university, and attempts to contact her have been unsuccessful. In 2023, during a particularly severe drought, hikers in the wooded area where the Jenkins house once stood discovered what appeared to be a stone staircase descending into the ground. Park rangers, responding to the report, found nothing but undisturbed earth. The hikers, a married couple with no history of mental illness or substance abuse, maintained that they had seen and photographed the stairs. Their phone, however, contained no such images, despite their insistence that they had taken several. The Jenkins case will likely remain unsolved, a footnote in the history of a small Georgia town that came into existence the same year two of its citizens vanished without explanation. Academics will continue to debate whether it represents a genuine mystery or merely the confluence of mental illness, rural isolation, and the human tendency to mythologize the unexplained. Paranormal enthusiasts will point to the physical evidence that defies conventional explanation. Skeptics will note the absence of conclusive proof. And in Pearson, people will continue to sleep with the lights on when they hear tapping in their walls. Some stories end, others merely wait. If you're ever passing through Atkinson County, you might consider stopping in Pearson. The Historical Museum still displays the artifacts from the case: the ring, the photographs, the mysterious note, and bag of soil. The curator will happily share the official version of events, sanitized for tourism and historical propriety. But if you speak with older residents, if you earn their trust and catch them in an unguarded moment, you might hear something different. Something about patterns in the walls and voices in the earth. Something about doors that shouldn't be opened and questions that shouldn't be asked. And if, during your stay, you wake in the darkness to the sound of gentle tapping from within your hotel room wall, a rhythmic pattern that seems almost like communication, remember the fate of Thomas and Margaret Jenkins. Remember James Foster. Remember that some mysteries are best left unsolved. Turn on the light. Wait for morning. And when you leave Pearson, don't look back. Don't listen for footsteps that match your own, coming from somewhere just beneath your feet.